The first new mechanic in the Pokemon TCG was Dark Pokemon, first introduced in the Team Rocket expansion. These Pokemon became known for their HP being slightly lower than normal, but having attacks that were slightly stronger than normal as well. These Pokemon were almost universally evolved Pokemon, which would evolve from a normal version of their basic stage. So Charmander would evolve into Dark Charmeleon, who would then evolve into Dark Charizard. Other than a small handful of trainer cards designed to completely offer them support, like the Boss's Way or later Rocket's Pokeball when they were reintroduced in Team Rocket Returns, Dark Pokemon were just largely a flavor mechanic rather than being anything particularly distinct, so a bit of a dud mechanic really. Although there were some fan favourites like Dark Charizard, Dark Gyarados and Dark Blastoise, these weren't super playable, maybe outside of Blastoise. Dark Vileplume did see a ton of play thanks to its Hay Fever power that would stop all trainers from being played from both players. This, as you can imagine, was incredible since at the time there was no item support to split, so Hay Fever was a metagame titan, paired with attackers like Snorlax, Kangaskhan and Alakazam. Owner's Pokemon. Much like Dark Pokemon, Owner's Pokemon are mostly a flavor mechanic rather than having concrete support. First introduced in Gym Heroes, Owner's Pokemon were a way to tie Pokemon cards into in-game characters, in a way we hadn't seen before, giving iconic characters like Misty her Psyduck in a TCG. Unfortunately, while this extra identity was cool from a collection standpoint, the cards were largely uninteresting, with the name being more like a flavor text than actually impacting games. In some cases, as with Misty, the connecting trainer card provided a slight benefit directly to her Pokemon, or Pokemon belonging to a specific trainer, but in other cases, like with Erica, there was absolutely zero connection to the owner's Pokemon whatsoever. And some of them were very impactful in a metagame like Erica's Jigglypuff, which actually ran the format for a long time, but that had nothing to do with it being Erica's Jigglypuff versus any other Jigglypuff, for example. Owner's Pokemon made their return, however, in the Journey expansion together in 2025, which has a much heavier focus on giving each trainer its own identity, which limits their splashability, since the Team Rocket cards, for example, are all tied together in the same way as Steven's and Cynthia's as well. This gives them all their own decks, sure, but none of these decks have been particularly great so far. The only owner's Pokemon that has seen a lot of meta-relevant play is Lily's Clefairy, and is by far the best one. Its ability would give Dragon types a weakness ×2 to Psychic, meaning it would check Raging Bolt and Dragapult decks nicely. Baby Pokemon. At last, with the release of Neo Genesis, the card design team released a mechanic that had a tangible, significant effect on gameplay. Baby Pokemon. Baby Pokemon were universally 30 hit point Pokemon with no weakness, resistance or retreat cost. They all had a variety of powerful attacks, like Pichu's Zap and Clefairy's legendary Eek, being two of the most prolific. But what made them all distinct was the baby rule. Instead, what made baby Pokemon unique was their chance to be completely immune to attack. When a player would attack a baby Pokemon in the active, the attacking player must flip a coin. And if it was tails, your opponent's turn would end without that attack going through. Most of the time, this would be a fun, unique way to prevent damage, slowing down games and giving you more time to set up. Meaning 50% of the time, baby Pokemon were an impenetrable wall. This made baby Pokemon by far the king of the Neo era, with Clefairy appearing in 3 to 4 copies in almost every single deck. While this style of card was replicated in the Heart Gold Soul Silver era, it wasn't quite the same. And every other printing of Clefairy, like the Grasping Draw that we have in format right now, they have all lacked the baby rule in its truest form, showing that this powerful mechanic was way too good to ever come back again. And it's kind of ironic that the first mechanic to really change the game was baby Pokemon, because even now, 20 years later, baby Pokemon like Budu still have 30 hit points, still have 0 energy attacks, and they still run the game. Budu single-handedly changed the form, making items and staples like Arven much worse due to the itchy pollen lock. Shining Pokemon. Shining Pokemon have appeared twice in the Pokemon TCG, first in Neo Revelation and later in Shining Legends. While the latter was mostly received as uninteresting and just an excuse to print cool shiny Pokemon, which looked amazing in binders by the way, the Neo era Shining Pokemon are widely regarded as some of the biggest failures in game design that the Pokemon TCG has ever seen. First of all, Shining Pokemon were restricted to 1 copy per deck. So while you could play multiple different Shining Pokemon, such as Shining Magikarp and Shining Gyarados, you could only play 1 of each. Additionally, these Pokemon all require multiple silly energy types for their attacks, on average requiring 3 different types per card, and their attacks were all terrible on top of that. The only upside to these Pokemon is that the ones that were evolved, like Gyarados, could be played as a basic, but that didn't really save them. Every single one of the original Shining Pokemon were completely unplayable, ranking Shining Pokemon as one of the worst mechanics the game has ever seen. Light Pokemon. In Neo Destiny, Pokemon tried to one-up Dark Pokemon by introducing Light Pokemon. And much like Dark Pokemon, Light Pokemon was a mechanic that was really built as flavor text rather than changing the way the game was played. Typically, they had hit points higher than normal, and then they would have some sort of beneficial effect tied to their attacks. But other than that, this mechanic was nothing special, and one of the most forgotten aspects in the Pokemon TCG's early history, only having appeared in 1 expansion, never really given the chance to shine. Crystal Pokemon. If you ever wanted to know the answer to the question, what if Shining Pokemon were even worse? Look no further than Crystal Pokemon. While they deviated from the rule that you can only play 1 per deck, this also came with the drawback of having to evolve into them if they featured an evolved Pokemon, such as Kabutops. And these Pokemon also maintain the atrocious energy cost for their attacks, with largely terrible effects as well. One aspect that does make Crystal Pokemon interesting was their shared Crystal type Pokebody, which changed their type from colourless to match the basic energy that was most recently attached to them. Realistically, these cards' only redeeming factor was their artwork, which was almost always universally liked. While Shining Pokemon were largely considered to be some of the worst mechanics in the history of the game, Crystal Pokemon are the reminder that somehow it can sometimes get worse. Pokemon EX. 9 years into the TCG's nearly 30-year history, the game saw its most ambitious mechanic yet, Pokemon EX. First appearing in the EX Ruby Sapphire expansion, Pokemon EX defined the mid-2000s for the Pokemon TCG, appearing in the finals of every single World Championship they were legal for, and appearing in the winning deck for 3 of them. These Pokemon are much like normal Pokemon, maintaining their normal typing, attack costs and more, but they had much stronger hit points, with Wailord having a monstrous 200 at the time, and attacks that would deal 200 damage like Lugia EX. These were formidable powerhouses, but they did come at a price, being worth 2 prize cards instead of 1 when they got knocked out, meaning you only had to knock out 3 EX Pokemon to win the game versus 6 normal 1 prize Pokemon. This aspect of the cards completely revolutionized strategy in Pokemon. Cases where there were forced evolutions with a good EX and a good normal Pokemon such as Blaziken or Gardevoir were insane. And it would give you an interesting decision fork where you would decide how much you wanted to use the EX version in the game versus the 1 prize one. Blaziken became particularly infamous for this, being one of the first extremely powerful EX Pokemon that also had a good 1 prize Pokemon that had insane synergy between them, since the EX would discard fire energy to deal massive damage, and the normal would attach those fire energy right back. And later on we would see some all EX decks like Lugia, Blastoise, Steelix. Following the EX era, Pokemon EX would disappear, right up until the Scarlet Violet era where they made their triumphant return. And just like before, these cards have proven to be extremely powerful and genuinely well received, with there being split evolution decks again like Gardevoir using the EX and the 1 prize one at the same time, showing that Pokemon EX are not just one of the most powerful mechanics in game history, but also one of the most loved as well. Team Aqua and Magma. Roughly 5 years after the introduction of Owner's Pokemon, we saw a subset of them kind of come back in Team Magma, Team Aqua. And in a lot of ways, these are what Owner's Pokemon really should have been at the start, as these were the core focus of the expansion when they were released, having much more archetype focused attacks and trainers cards to make them feel much more cohesive. Additionally, a substantial number of them were also dual type Pokemon, featuring their primary type as well as being part dark, to exhibit that they were being owned by an evil team. While Team Aqua were largely underwhelming, Team Magma was so powerful that it won all 3 A's divisions at the first World Championships in 2004, a sweep that we haven't seen again since. Pokemon Star. EX Rocket Returns is typically remembered for the return of Dark Pokemon and Rocket's Pokemon, but this expansion also marked the introduction of Pokemon Star, some of the most expensive and collectible cards we currently have in the Pokemon TCG. Much like Shining Pokemon, you were only allowed to play a single copy of a shiny Pokemon in your deck, but this limitation expanded to be 1 copy total, so you couldn't play multiple different Star in your deck at the same time. Funnily enough, these 3 Pokemon Star were the ones that saw the most play out of the gates, with Mew Star and Jolteon Star seeing a lot of play towards the end of the EX era. While they were very iconic with a few powerful entries, this mechanic is largely not known for being powerful, even though it is one of the most collectible. Delta Species. There is no mechanic in the history of Pokemon that is beloved as Delta Species, released in the expansion of the same name. Delta Species Pokemon's main quirk was their irregular typing, and the fun head lore of imagining a fighting Executor or a metal type Charizard. While some of them were just metal types in addition to their typical typing, many were completely different, with some of the most iconic being a lightning type Fraligator or a fire type Gardevoir for example. In addition, there were a few cards that provided direct support to Delta Species Pokemon like Holland Scientist, and many Delta Species Pokemon saw a fair amount of play, with there being occasional strategies that completely revolved around them, like Raichu eggs that absolutely decimated US Nationals. But in general, they were much like Dark Pokemon, where their mechanic was mostly flavor rather than revolutionizing the game. Holland's Pokemon. The latter half of the EX era was focused around exploring the Holland region, a TCG exclusive area. This was the origin of the Delta Species phenomenon, but is also the origin of Holland's Pokemon as well, as introduced in EX Delta Species. Holland's Pokemon were just a small group of 5 Pokemon that could attach themselves as energy cards, with Holland's Magnemite and Holland's Voltorb attaching themselves as colorless energy, Holland's Magnemite and Holland's Electrode all attaching themselves as a double rainbow. These completely changed the format from their introduction right up until their rotation, causing decks like the iconic LBS to exist, where otherwise it would have been impossible to power up Lugia EX's Elemental Blast. While not being particularly memorable as Pokemon, with only Holland's cast form having a useful attack, their role as energy cards makes them impossible to acknowledge as anything less than some of the most powerful Pokemon in the game's history. Pokemon Level X. Diamond and Pearl marked the first time since 2003 that Pokemon EX did not appear as a mechanic in the TCG, but this was done to make way for the game's latest mechanic, Level X. These Pokemon were pretty straightforward, effectively being an additional stage of evolution on top of a Pokemon's final evolution form. For example, Volt would evolve into Curlia, who would then evolve into Gardevoir, who would then evolve into Gardevoir Level X on top of the Gardevoir, but it had to be in the active spot to level up. This would give the Pokemon more hit points, additional attacks, Pokepowers or Pokebodies, and it's also allowed the Pokemon to use any attacks, Pokepowers or bodies that the previous level had access to. These cards were extremely successful at the competitive level, being a core part of the World Championship winning strategies in 2008, 2009 and 2010. With that being said, some of the most successful Level X were largely only successful due to the powerful cards underneath them, for example like Infernape and Empoleon, who would have been successful even if they didn't have a Level X. Pokemon SP. When Platinum was released, the Pokemon SP came along with it, standing for Special Pokemon. Pokemon SP were the latest variation of Owner's Pokemon, with an addendum at the end of their name, such as Luxray GL or Garchomp C, to designate what type of trainer that was associated with that Pokemon, so Luxray Gym Leader and Garchomp Cynthia for example. Pokemon SP by far were the most coherent variant of Owner's Pokemon yet, being able to work together to form formidable strategies that all actually work, such as the hyper-aggressive Luxchomp or the slow and tanky Dialga-Chomp. These decks were made to work by the extremely successful and powerful trainers at their disposal, such as Poketurn or Energy Gain, as well as being universally basic Pokemon as well, which made them much easier to fit into a deck. To say that these cards were successful would be a vast understatement, as they were part of the World Championship winning decks for all the championships that they were legal for, while also dominating the start of the 2011 season right up until the mid-season rotation with the release of Black and White. Pokemon Prime. First released in Heart Gold Soul Silver, Pokemon Prime was perhaps one of the most uninteresting mechanics in the history of the Pokemon trading card game, with the only unique attributes being that they were, well, had a unique art style to be honest. These cards almost universally exceeded their regular forms in power, in hit points and attacks, and they kind of produced the idea that there was no point in ever having a normal Typhlosion when Typhlosion Prime existed. These cards were generally pretty good though, even if uninteresting, with Typhlosion, Magnezone, Yanmega and Donphan all being metagame titans. Pokemon Legend. Perhaps the uninteresting nature of Pokemon Prime was so that they could compensate for Pokemon Legend, which reintroduced multi-prize cards to the Pokemon TCG. Pokemon Legend required you to have both halves in your hand in order to put them both down into play. These cards often feature 2 Pokemon on them with extremely powerful attack and combined typing as well. In general, these cards weren't particularly good, seeing very little play for most of their lifespan. However, that didn't stop them from finding their niche in 2011, where they appeared in both finalist decks at the World Championships, with Rayquaza Deoxys taking it all home. Pokemon EX Capitals. The black and white era of the Pokemon TCG is generally regarded as introducing big basics to the Pokemon TCG, cards like Reshiram and Zekrom, but that was taken to the next level of power with the release of Next Destinies and Pokemon EX. Not to be confused with Pokemon lowercase EX from the mid-2000s and 2020s. These are different, because Pokemon capital letters EX were gigantic basic Pokemon for the time they were released, often having 170 or 180 hit points, towering above one prize cards. The most infamous of these was of course Mewtwo EX, which warped the entire Pokemon game around it, giving birth to the term Mewtwo Wars, where whoever had the most Mewtwo EX in their deck would win. Darkrai was equally dominant afterwards, with Mewtwo and Darkrai decks often being paired together, occupying every top 8 slot at the 2012 World Championships, but Tornadus, Keldeo EX were also very strong as well. There's never been a mechanic in the Pokemon TCG as impactful as Pokemon EX, marking a new era of the game and opening the metaphorical Pandora's box of extremely overpowered multi-prize Pokemon cards that would change the game for years to come, with one prize decks almost completely being pushed out of the format while Pokemon EX were legal. Team Plasma. For one reason or another, Pokemon keeps coming back to different variants of owners' Pokemon, this time with a tag to designate their ownership to Team Plasma. Notably, this did not change the Pokemon's name, meaning you could have 4 regular Kyurem and 4 Team Plasma Kyurem in your deck at the same time. These cards were genuinely cohesive around the Plasma Energy, a blank special energy card that provided 1 colorless energy, but it gave access to Pokemon's attacks and unique abilities as well. Like Lugia EX being able to use Plasma Gale, but if it couldn't discard a Plasma Energy then it couldn't use it. Thundurus EX's Thunderous Noise would let you discard an energy from your opponent's active if it had a Plasma Energy attached as well. And Team Plasma Genesect's ability Red Signal would activate whenever you attach a Team Plasma Energy to it. And Cole's Machine did make attaching Plasma Energy much easier through its item card. While the Team Plasma archetype was generally successful in the metagame, it was mostly forgettable outside of occasional success from its release in 2013 rather until it rotated in 2015. Mega Pokemon EX. In X and Y, Pokemon deviated from the usual pattern of releasing a new core mechanic at the start of a generation, and instead they continued with Pokemon EX, but this time they expanded on the mechanic a little bit, adding Mega Evolution in the form of Mega Pokemon EX, where you could evolve a basic EX into a Mega EX, effectively making Megas stage 1s. At first these cards were really bad, because you automatically had to end your turn upon Mega Evolution, but in Phantom Forces a new series of cards called Spirit Links were introduced that would suppress this condition, so you could evolve a Pokemon into a Mega Pokemon without ending your turn if you had a Spirit Link attack. Even with Spirit Links though, most Megas were genuinely considered to be underwhelming, only winning the World Championships in 2016. But that was the greatest Cinderella run of all time with Mega Aldina. Now it looks like the time of the release of Pokemon ZA that Mega Pokemon are back, but this time with no Spirit Links to balance them out. So all you have to do is evolve into them as if they were a normal Pokemon. So Mega Absol is considered a basic, and Mega Gardevoir is a normal stage 2. To compensate, it looks like this time around they are going to be worth 3 prize cards instead of 2, so their hit points and damage have been pumped up to make them worth it. So far from the community, the reactions have been pretty negative due to the hangover from tag teams, so we'll have to see if these worries about Mega Pokemon are well founded or not. Ancient traits. When the Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire video games were released, there was not much potential for new design space since Primal Reversion was just an alternative spin on the Mega Evolution mechanic, with the introduction of ancient traits. For lack of a better description, these were effectively just abilities that weren't treated as abilities. Most of them ended up being underwhelming, other than having extended artwork and niche applications, like Regirock's use in expanded format and Primal Groudon being completely immune to trainers. This would give them both a place in the metagame. The ancient trait Growth and Heal were all pretty mediocre, seeing no real success outside of collector pieces. But Delta Plus, where you would take an extra prize card if it KO'd something, and Delta Evolution were both very strong, because Delta Evolution you could evolve on the same turn or the first turn a card was played. With Plus winning the World Championships in 2015 via Articuno, and the latter made Mega Rayquaza EX a core part of the metagame for its entire legality, never really leaving Tier 1 or Tier 2 status. Pokemon Break. At the end of the XY era, Pokemon Break were released. There's nothing more than a repeat design of Level X, to be honest. These cards weren't really special in terms of introducing new game design space, but their power level was largely underwhelming, except for Greninja Break or Zoroark Break, the latter of which you could be argued was only really playable due to the Mind Jack Zoroark that you had to use to get it into play. Greninja though was a top tier threat, appearing in the top 8 of every single World Championship it was legal for except for one age division. Outside of this very specific card though, Pokemon Break were almost universally terrible. Pokemon GX. In the Sun and Moon games, trainers have access to a once per battle attack called Z moves. When the Sun and Moon era came to Pokemon TCG, the cards had to reflect this in some sort of capacity. At the end of the Sun and Moon block, they tried to reflect this with the miserable failure that was Z Crystal Tool cards, but they were able to succeed with GX Pokemon and their GX attacks. These special attacks were much like the in-game Z moves, since you could only use one of them per game. And of course, they were really powerful. While most of the earliest ones were a bit underwhelming, cards like Solgaleo and Soul Burst did eventually get a time to shine in the metagame. And there were a lot of unique ones that weren't just about dealing massive damage, like Rayquaza's Tempest GX to draw a ton of cards, or Decidueye GX's Hollow Hunt to get back cards from the discard pile. A lot of them flopped hard though, like Palosland GX, proving that they couldn't all knock it out the park. By the end of the Sun and Moon block though, GX attacks were completely game warping, with some of them adding effects to the end of the game, but we will get onto those a little bit later. Ultra Beasts. Another variant on the owner's Pokemon mechanic. Ultra Beasts were a distinction given to Pokemon that were Ultra Beasts in the game, as well as some forms of Necrozma, despite it not actually officially being an Ultra Beast. While all the Ultra Beasts are linked by a handful of trainer cards, they generally do not have many synergies with each other. Their main sense of identity is that all their attacks interact with prize cards in some way. Other than that, this label is mostly just flavour. Buzzwole was the obvious winner here, with 3 playable cards. Its GX card, 1 prize card and tag team card, all being very playable. And Guzzlord is a focal point in Dark type GLC as well. Prism Star. The next installment of singleton Pokemon are Prism Star. Much like Shining Pokemon, you are only limited to 1 of each, rather than 1 total, giving rise to a handful of strategies that would utilise multiple different Prism Stars, such as Percephalon GX Naganadel, using Heat Factory to draw cards, Beast Energy to deal extra damage, and sometimes even Lusamine to block damage as well. In order to prevent the recursion of powerful Prism Stars, the cards were required to be sent to the Lost Zone after they were used. Additionally, Prism Stars can be Stadiums or Special Energy, a distinction only held by another type of cards on this list. In general, these cards get the distinctions of being good, but not particularly memorable relative to some of the more iconic entries on this list. But they did manage to create some archetypes on their own, like Arceus Prism Star, which made the White Kyurem archetype possible because of its attack. In order to shake up the Pokemon TCG between the release of Ultra Sun and Moon and Sword and Shield, Tag Team Pokemon GX were released, and with them some of the most broken, powerful cards we've ever seen. Hated by many, Tag Team featured 2 or 3 Pokemon per card, with extremely powerful attacks and high hit points, ranging from 240 all the way up to 300. In an effort to balance these Pokemon, they were made to be worth 3 prize cards, a first in the Pokemon TCG, meaning you ain't had to knock out 2 Tag Team Pokemon to win a game. They also had special GX attacks that were powerful on their own, but could be boosted to unreal strengths if you had extra energy attached to them. The most infamous of these of course was Arceus, Dialga and Palkia GX, or better known as ADP. While this card was relatively underwhelming when it first came out, there's never been a card more universally hated than ADP, and for good reason. Its GX attack altered Creation GX. It completely warped the game around itself, and Gate kept many strategies focused on attacking with Pokemon that were only ever worth 1 prize card. Tag teams were without a doubt the most powerful mechanic the game had ever seen at the time, and may even continue to hold that distinction to this day. There was also tag team supporter cards as well that have multiple effects that often required you to discard cards from your hand to get the second effect. These were all mostly really good. Cynthia Caitlyn would get back supporters and draw some cards, Mallow and Lana would let you heal and switch Pokemon, Guzmahala let you search for a ton of resources, much like how Secret Box does now. These are all much more playable thanks to the Tag Call item card, which searches for 2 tag team cards at the same time. So from ADP completely pushing one prices out the game, Luke Metal being one of the most strongest versions of Stall we've ever seen, and from Pokemon being relevant from the second it was printed to the second it rotated, tag teams really were crazy. Pokemon V. Quite frankly, Pokemon V is little more than Pokemon Capital EX with a new name. However, they are also much stronger. Designed to contend with tag teams, cards like Zacian V were completely overpowered, with 220 hit points, a 230 damaging attack, and an ability that would let you draw 3 cards. This meant at one point Zacian had 4 tier 1 decks in format: ADP, Combo Zacian, Luke Metal Zacian, and Mill. And towards the latter era of Pokemon V, cards like Genesect V showed that it was still possible for Pokemon to outdo themselves, with many of the end of era Sword and Shield sets producing some of the most powerful cards we have ever seen. For example, Genesect would draw you like 20 plus cards a turn. Pokemon Vmax. While Pokemon V are not interesting on their own, they were made more interesting with their variations. Pokemon Vmax was the first of these variations, as a way to incorporate Dynamax into the TCG. These powerful 3 prize card Pokemon are known for their absurd high hit point totals and simple high damaging attacks. Most of the earliest ones like Dragapult Vmax or Eternatus Vmax were just extremely high statted cards that were good by virtue of having bigger numbers than everything else at the time. Unfortunately for Pokemon Vmax though, the success was largely underwhelming, apart from outliers like Dragapult, Eternatus and Mew, which did win the World Championships in 2023. Amazing Rares. One of the most confusing and inexplicable 2-sets experiments in the history of the game. Amazing Rares were another shot at the Shining and Crystal Pokemon, in the sense that they attacked for 3 different energy types. These cards generally were awful, but towards the end of the Sword and Shield era, where you had Archeops and Mirage Gate to power them up, they actually saw a lot of meta-relevant play, with Yveltal, Raikou and Rayquaza seeing a lot of play at the top tiers of the metagame. Battle Styles, perhaps the second best adaptation on Owner's Pokemon. Battle Styles introduced 2 different archetypes into the game, Single Strike and Rapid Strike, to represent Urshifu's different forms in the video games. These were extremely coherent strategies that worked really well together, and their flavour was perfect, with Rapid Strike focusing on multiple weaker attacks to accomplish some obscenely powerful plays, like using Gmax Rapid Flow to pick up multiple KOs at the same time. And then you had Single Strike that focused on big one-hit knockouts with cards like Tyranitar V and Gmax One Blow, that'd all be powered up by a Single Strike energy. These went on for about 9 months until a TCG exclusive battle style known as Fusion Strike was released. Fusion Strike was meant to be a hybrid of both the styles, technical skills, and big hefty powerful knockouts as well. As one would expect, the ability to draw a ton of cards via Genesect and take one-hit knockouts via power tablets boosted the Fusion Strike Mew VMAX deck to be absurdly overpowered at the time, and it was so powerful that it remained a top tier strategy for almost every single day of its legality, warranting direct multiple counters from Creatures Inc., but still won a world championship with those in format. While the mechanic of battle styles weren't particularly interesting on their own, the Fusion Strike style in particular is certainly one of the most powerful archetypes in the history of all Pokemon TCG. Pokemon V Union. Amidst the era of battle styles, Pokemon V Union snuck in as a small group of promo cards. Conceptually, Pokemon V Union is undeniably the coolest mechanic in the history of the Pokemon TCG, assembling 4 different cards from the discard pile to make one gigantic card with half a dozen attacks and abilities, turning it into a sort of final boss of sorts that was worth 3 prize cards. With that being said, cool doesn't necessarily win tournament, and Pokemon V Union were genuinely terrible for most of their lifespan. That was until the North America International Championship in 2022, where a certain group of players appeared with a secret strategy, Mewtwo V Union Stall deck, that embraced the final boss nature of Pokemon V Union perfectly, by effectively creating an infinite hit point Pokemon that was impossible for the majority of decks to overcome. Mewtwo V Union would ultimately be the only one of the 5 V Union to ever see an ounce of competitive success, making V Union one of the most failed mechanics in TCG history. Pokemon V Star. Early 2022 marked a new era for the Pokemon TCG. After nearly 2 long years, in-person play was finally resumed as the COVID-19 pandemic came to an end, And with the new era of in-person play came a new mechanic as well, Pokemon V Star. This mechanic took the concept of Pokemon Vmax and scaled it back a bit, with smaller hit point numbers and reducing their card yield down to 2. Additionally, they introduced V Star Powers, a sort of remastered version of GX attacks that also introduced abilities as well. The first of these V Star, Arceus V Star, is one of the most powerful Pokemon in TCG history, appearing in day 2 of every single major tournament from its release in 2022 until June 2024. Not just that, but it also tied Guardians Rising Garbodor for the most top 32 appearances of a single archetype in any event, with 24 out of 32 being Arceus V-Star decks at its peak. With this unmatched level of dominance, it's hard to fathom how they could get better considering Arceus was the first V-Star Pokemon, but somehow they got better and better as new sets came out. With Silver Tempest introducing Lugia V-Star, quite often regarded as the best deck of all time, and then Regidrago V-Star after that, with Regidrago V-Star being in the same deck, which was initially terrible, but then rocketed to Tier 1, Tier S status in 2024. At the end of their legality, it is impossible to acknowledge Pokemon V-Star as anything less than the most powerful mechanic in TCG history. Radiant Pokemon. Pokemon's latest edition of singleton Pokemon came in the form of Radiant Pokemon, which are much like Pokemon Star in that you can only play one total copy in any of your deck. These have seen varying amounts of success, with the worst never even being considered for competitive play, but the best of the bunch, mainly Radiant Charizard and Radiant Greninja, being two of the most powerful cards in the Sword and Shield era. Radiant Greninja might quite possibly be the best card of all time. A basic Pokemon that drew cards with its ability and had a crazy game-ending attack that would often wipe multiple Pokemon at the same time. Radiant Charizard is very good as well. Its 5 energy attack would reach into V-Star Pokemon with Choice Band support and could be used for as low as 1 energy after your opponent has taken a few prize cards. The rest of the Radiant Pokemon though were pretty awful. Terra Pokemon. Scarlet and Violet introduced Pokemon EX back into the TCG with a few changes, mostly just making the stats more to be honest. They did shake the mechanic up a little bit though by introducing Terra Pokemon, which can be split into 2 categories. Most of the Terra Pokemon fall into the first category, which is just alternate typings. For example, Charizard EX is printed as a Darkness type Pokemon, but it does retain its Fire energy attack cost. The other category in Terra Pokemon are the Terra Stellar cards only seen in Stellar Crown and Surging Sparks and Prismatic Evolutions. And these are Terra Pokemon that retain their original typing, but also have a second attack that attacks for 3 different energy types, essentially acting as modern Crystal Pokemon, such as Terrapagos EX, using Grass, Water and Lightning energy. Regardless of which style Terra they are, they have the innate trait of being protected from damage while they're on the bench. And while these Terra Stellar attacks are normally very strong, good luck getting 3 different energy on them regularly, so these haven't been terribly successful. Additionally, they all benefit from the same Terra support, such as Noctowl, Area Zero Underdepths and Terra Orbs. While not being the most cohesive of mechanics, it does have some cases of cards that bind them all together, and cards that are all extremely flavorful to the terrestrial mechanic like the video game. With some Terra cards like Dragapult, Tilmask Ogapon and Flareon X, it's safe to say the mechanic has been okay. Scarlet Violet also introduced the Paradox Pokemon into the TCG. These are essentially rehashed versions of Team Plasma, Ultra Beast and Battle Style mechanics, except this time they focus on the ancient and future Pokemon found in Area Zero of the games. Each of these mechanics have been pretty successful in the TCG, with the finals of the 2024 World Championships featuring a future against an ancient deck. Future decks generally focus on low cost, low damage attacks that can be powered up via a flood of Pokemon like Iron Crown EX, or Iron Hands that takes extra prize cards with its attack amp you very much. And ancient decks focus on high cost, high damage attacks, which are paid for by energy acceleration like Professor Siler's Vitality. While not being particularly interesting, the mechanic has been very successful, with Raging Bolt being a mainstay in the format as soon as Tilmask Ogapon dropped, and Future having a place in the format thanks to Iron Hands. But it must be said that the Future tag for Iron Hands has been largely irrelevant, outside of the brief Future box deck archetype. We have also just seen the return of the SPEC trainer classification cards back into the TCG. Now before, in the black and white era, these were tools or item cards with very strong effects, although back in that time, computer search was by far the best A-Spec. However now, A-Specs are back and they are items, tools and special energy cards, and there have been a whole treasure trove of them which have been legal. At the start, Prime Catcher was probably the best one, but now we're seeing Legacy Energy being used, Secret Box being used, Maximum Belt being used, and quite honestly, this new version of SPECs are probably some of my favourite mechanics we've ever seen. But let me know what you think about this video, what you agree with, what you disagree with. I'd love to know. And please consider subscribing if you listen to this, because I'm so close to 20,000 subscribers now and it's a target of mine. If you like this video, why don't you watch this video here, where you look at a 15-year-old player who is doing unfathomable things in the Pokemon TCG.